So we're here, doubtsaloud listeners. We're part 2 on our topic of homosexuality in the Bible, and we are going to launch into this with Frances, who had lost connection with us last time, and now she has returned. Ed, maybe you could just recap our episode, part 1 of homosexuality in the Bible, ready then for Frances to do some deep diving into the Old Testament.
Yes. What we did was treat the whole Bible sequentially on its, I think you said there were 7 or 9 places where
there's basically 7 people talk about, yeah.
Okay. And we saw that for some of them, it was nothing to see here. And for some of them, you needed to do quite a bit of wrestling if you wanted the Bible to say that same-sex sexual activity and even marriage is fine. And we ended up without clarity, as normally these things do. And my feeling is that if you're going to be a good evangelical and treat the Bible very seriously and come to it assuming that it's God's word with one message, the message would be that same-sex sexual activity is sinful. We then had a bit of a play around with some of the consequences that produces in the kind of angst of, say, a mum with a same-sex attracted child who, so what do? Do they stick to their interpretation of the Bible, or do they go with their inner kind of sense of what's right and what's wrong? So we discussed all that.
Yeah.
And that left us wanting to do 2 things. One is to have a look at the culture and background to the Leviticus verses that we talked about as if we were believing Christians rather than as historians. And the sort of deeper work that Frances has done that we were missing on what is the history and what does it mean in its culture and setting and all the rest of it. And if we get time, we'll also have a quick look at homosexuality around the religious world.
Okay.
Right.
Okay,
there.
Yeah, Francis. So, let's start with the ancient Near East culture around the time of the formation of the Leviticus Torah law book.
Well, there's not an awful lot of stuff about what we would call homosexuality or heterosexuality, because I think that the important thing to understand is that homosexuality and heterosexuality are the ways that we in the modern world understand and categorize certain sorts of human sexual behavior. In the ancient Near East, they didn't really have those categories. They understood that sexual activity did take place between men and that it could take place between women, but they didn't tend to think of sexuality or a sexual preference being part of somebody's personality. So I think it's important to understand that, both in understanding the general ancient Near East background and in understanding to some extent the attitude that was taken towards it in the Old Testament. So in the ancient Near East, there was more a concept of sex, of sexual activity rather than sexuality. And their attitude to male on male sex was not so much that it was terribly wrong as that there was an element of domination and submission. So the active partner was the dominant one, and the passive partner was submissive. And from that, they drew from it that there was something for the passive partner. There was something in some way perhaps demeaning is perhaps a bit strong, but it showed that you were the weaker of the two participants. So it was often, for that reason, linked with an older male being the active partner and a younger male being the submissive or passive partner.
Right.
And
so can I jump in there for a bit?
Sure.
Because we did talk about that in the Greek culture, which is presumably several hundred years, if not 1,000 years later than we're talking about
yes.
here. So is it something that you're talking about from Mesopotamia or from Greek culture later on?
No, I think it was something that was generally understood, and in the Egyptian, in some of the Egyptian testaments that people leave, they will say of themselves, "I have never had sex with a boy," and the indication there was that I have not been someone who has tried to demean somebody weaker than me. So it was something that was found in Mesopotamia and in Egypt.
Right.
And there's an article on it from the University of Helsinki, which I think we can link to, and it covers the whole of this history from Mesopotamia, from Egypt through into the ancient Israel and up to Christianity. And I think there was probably not much change through all of that time, but I think the significant development probably is in terms of Israel and ancient Israel, that is, and their complete condemnation of homosexuality. Or was there?
Okay, so that was actually a step outside of they weren't just aping the culture around them, they were actually stepping something different.
Well, I think that appears to be the case, although as perhaps we'll go into in a moment, there have recently been some suggestions that it wasn't completely forbidden originally in ancient Israel.
Okay.
So I don't
Andrew,
know whether
your ears pricking up.
A little bit, but carry on.
Oh dear. Right. Okay. Well, recently there's been a kind of a challenge to the notion that Leviticus was that I suppose the ancient Hebrews always condemned homosexual acts, and there's the main condemnation comes from Leviticus, as I think you dealt with in the earlier program. But a scholar, Aydin Dershowitz, and I think we should be able to provide a link to an article about this, about his writing on this, wrote an article called The Secret History of Leviticus, in which he argues that actually originally homosexuality was permitted in amongst the Hebrews. And the way he argues this is that it's generally accepted that Leviticus was created over a long period of time by more than one author. And that he says Leviticus 18 was inserted by a later author, and the earlier texts were silent about sex between men. And how does he argue this? Well, he refers to the fact that it says, the nakedness of your father and the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness. And what he says about this is that you can tell that originally this was a verse about incest, about not having incestuous sex with either of your parents. But he says then a later writer came along and inserted the last parts to make it all about having sex with the mother. And the what he says is that if Leviticus prohibits homosexual incest, then that, by implication, indicates that non-incestuous homosexual coupling would be okay. Because if you compare, if you have a law against murder, then you don't need a specific law to say you're not allowed to murder your father. Or conversely, if you have a law that says you shall not murder your father, then that would imply that otherwise murder is okay. So he says that because the later writer introduced a new rule banning all homosexual sex, that made the rule on incestuous homosexual sex superfluous. And so they then tried to fudge it by saying this was all about uncovering the nakedness of your mother. So that's what he says. I don't know, do you want, I mean, as you can imagine, there's been pushback, but do you want to sort of, do either of you want to offer any thoughts on that?
The uncovering nakedness is an interesting thing. So you're saying that it doesn't mean, because it's very common to understand that it's a sexual thing going on there.
I think that is what it means, but I mean, perhaps what the counter argument to this is that uncovering nakedness can mean having sexual intercourse, but it doesn't just mean that. It means dishonoring. And apparently, I think you can draw a parallel with references to, let me get hold of it, sorry, I can't find my notes on this. Noah and uncovering his nakedness, that he was humiliated. So so what the argument against it is that what they're saying is that if you have sex with your mother, you're humiliating your father. Which actually quite a strange reason, isn't it? That's why you shouldn't have sex with your mother, because it's sort of like humiliating your father. You might think there might be rather more to it than that, but there you are. I mean, there is a reply by Will Graham where he does use that
I'm trying to catch up with this. So as we've got it now, Leviticus 18 verse 7 in the NIV says, do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. Do not have sexual relations with her.
Yes.
So that's now,
I mean, there are various translations, but yes.
But presumably it always assumes you're a man, because men are the only people that seem to matter to these authors.
These laws. Yeah.
Yes.
So it's what you've said doesn't seem to apply to that, because of your mother's obviously of different sex. So it would need to say that.
Well, I think that the argument is that it's prohibiting incest. It's not, and so.
But if this is addressing
originally, it said, "Don't have sex with your mother. Don't have sex with your father," and then the later author came in to say, "Don't have sex with your mother, because then you'll be dishonoring your father."
Oh, I see. So someone has found some early versions of this that aren't the ones that got translated into English.
No. It's not. I'm afraid it's not as simple as that. What Dershowitz is saying is that you can detect the hand of a later author, although we don't have any earlier versions. If you look at it, you can see that it's a bit like the two versions of the flood story, that a later author just added something in. Or perhaps another analogy would be where Jesus says in one of the Gospels, you can't divorce your wife. And in another one, he says you can't divorce your wife except for adultery, then you can divorce her. And I think that what Dershowitz is arguing is that originally it said, don't have sex with your mother, don't have sex with your father. And then because a later author wanted to say that all homosexual sex was forbidden, he looked at it and thought, oh, well, I better, I'd better make this, I better sort of put a spin on this so that it's made clear that this is not about forbidding sex with your father, because sex with your father is forbidden anyway, because that would be male on male homosexual sex.
So the actual bit of evidence that Dershowitz is actually using, actually what he's observing about the text, is a fairly awkward way of phrasing what is now translated, do not dishonor your father by having sexual relations with your mother.
Yes, that's it. Yes. He's saying that they transferred it from don't have sex with your father to don't dishonor your father by having sex with your mother. So making it all about having sex with your mother rather than general incest against incest with either parent.
Now, the way you've described it, to me, the two analogies you used, or the analogous texts you used, say an awful lot to me, because with the flood story, I've had this understanding that it's this documentary theory where the collator of Genesis had both versions available to him on the desk, as it were, and mashed them together. And because he was so wanting to honor the text that he was using, he didn't do any smoothing over to make them agree. He just preferred to put them together. That's my understanding of Genesis. And then my understanding of Matthew using Mark is completely different. He didn't have one text on the table. He didn't have two. He only had one text on the table, and that was Mark. And he used Mark and changed it to suit his purposes.
Yes. And so, I think that is a point. Well, one of the points made by people.
I haven't finished my point yet, but sorry, carry on.
I'm sorry. It was so good so far. I thought you'd made your point.
No, well,
I thought it was brilliant.
The killer point is, I thought Leviticus is supposed to be part of the documentary theory. So it would be if there is something funny going on, it wouldn't be somebody altering a text because he had a problem, but putting two texts together. That so it's not a sequential. It's not the author isn't manipulating in the way that, say, Matthew is manipulating Mark, to put it in using a negative word. This whole picture of an author with one text that he needs to correct goes against the documentary theory that we have for the Torah. Yes,
I think that is a weakness in Dershowitz's argument. In fact, I've got to say, I would like Dershowitz to be right, because I would like, as far as possible, for religious folk to see the Bible as not condemning homosexuality, because even though I'm not a believer myself, I do understand that these texts cause real unhappiness to real people. And therefore, even though I, coming from the outside, objectively would say the Bible does condemn homosexuality, I sort of want it not to, because I don't want people to have to suffer what they do suffer by feeling rejected and just feeling that they can't be a part of something that they do believe in. So
I've got pushback on that as well.
I think Aydin Dershowitz's theory is interesting.
It's good fun. I like it. I like the idea.
I don't find it very convincing.
Yeah.
And we can put the link to perhaps to Will Graham's pushback. Some of Will Graham's arguments I think are not very good. I mean, particularly his argument that anyone who thinks that there are two authors or more than one author to Leviticus, they're all liberals, like liberals boo, so we
yes,
can,
exactly.
we can
That was my other point I was
that.
going to jump in with.
Yes, yeah.
If you're going to solve, the problem is solved, it is created by the believer wanting this to be the word of God and perfect in every way. And you're not going to solve that by showing them that actually it isn't perfect in every way, and an author is being a little bit free and loose.
Yes. Now, I don't know whether we can come on to something. Sort of stop me if this isn't something you want to go into. But I did start looking at how the debate about gay sexuality is going on in Judaism.
Oh, lovely, yes.
Using my go-to resource, which is myvirtualjewishlearning.com, which is a great resource for anybody who wants to, who isn't part of the Jewish community, but wants to try and get some understanding of, how the Jewish community views the Bible and how, generally how they regard faith. And what's happening in Judaism, based on that, is that there is a very similar debate to that going on in Christianity. And a lot of the answers are the same or similar. So within Judaism, a lot of people, and you'll find links to articles, if you go to myvirtualjewishlearning.com, to say what was being condemned was not actually homosexuality itself, but the connection with certain heathen rituals, certain pagan rituals, which they wanted Jewish people obviously not to take part in, and it was that they were condemning. And they weren't condemning loving, committed relationships between two people of the same sex. So does that sound at all familiar to anyone?
Yeah, I've heard that sort of thing. For many times, actually, way back. And that's where the difficulty comes, isn't it? It's like, because sometimes it sounds like the scholarly you get, and the more you deep dive, you realize, it possibly wasn't meaning what we think it means. On the other hand, it can look like desperately trying to make the Bible say something that it isn't. And people would react both with both of those, because they could genuinely be onto something, or they could actually be, this is a stretch to get out of a tight spot. That's
absolutely right. Now there's an article by a Rabbi Klavan, that's Klaven. I'll perhaps try and send some of these links over to you. It's also on My Virtual Jewish Learning, and it's called To Plant or Not Plant Seed. And he looks at this again. He looks at this question of homosexuality, and he says, or the condemnation in Leviticus of sex between two men, and he says, well, it says that. But why? Why would they say that? And he says that it was because they saw the waste of seed, of semen, as a breach of the divine command. And the divine command was be fruitful and multiply. I think was one of the first things that God is supposed to have said to Adam and Eve. And it was also made a command after the flood. So it was seen as a breach of that command. And a rabbi called Rashi, who a medieval rabbi, said in his commentaries on the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, anyone who does not engage in reproduction should be compared to one who sheds blood, which indicates that they deserve the death penalty. And the rabbi who is writing this article, To Plant or Not Plant the Seed, says this was all part of the perception that it was so important to use the male seed to create life. And he says, if you think about it, though, if we're going to say that because that reasoning makes gay sex between men so wrong that they're worthy of death, what about use of condoms? What about masturbation? So he says you know, we don't all go around saying you're not allowed to masturbate or you're not allowed to use condoms. We accept those.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
some do. Yeah, no, I know. But I mean, I think he's addressing perhaps a wider audience. He says, if we're going to be consistent, then we should also be condemning people who masturbate or people who have sex with a condom. And again, does that ring any bells? You know, you're taking this particular line from the Old Testament, but think about all the other things that are in the Old Testament that you don't get so worried about. I mean, you know, isn't it the same thing like Christians will say, well, you don't mind about eating shellfish, do you? You know, it's also in Leviticus. And so he's taking a very similar approach. I would take Rabbi Klavan to be either Reform Jewish or perhaps even liberal Jewish. But
is he alive today? Is he completely?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh yeah. As far as I know, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, he's this was a modern article. He was talking about a rabbi in the Middle Ages, but he's I believe he's still with us.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get my bearings. He wasn't Victorian or something. It's
oh no. I think in Victoria. No, I think this is a much more recent take on gay male sex. Between gay male sex. Now the Orthodox Jewish community has a compassionate approach. Again, sound familiar? So they don't condemn people for being gay, but they do say you cannot practice. That is not allowed. Except Orthodox Jews have now their first openly gay Orthodox rabbi, who is Stephen Greenberg. And he has written a book called Wrestling with God and Men, Homosexuality in the Jewish Tradition. So there we are. You know,
so it's all happening in there as well.
It's all, even in the Orthodox community in Judaism, there's movement towards this liberalizing attitude. And then I also had a look at lesbianism. Do you want to know about lesbianism?
Yeah.
Oh.
What man doesn't want to know about lesbianism?
That's right. Yeah. That's why it's so surprising there's no laws in the Old Testament about lesbianism. Well, there would be, wouldn't you?
Because men don't feel threatened by it.
Yes, there is complete silence, apparently, until the 4th century, when there's a midrash.
4th century Common Era.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So, and then there's a midrash which cites the laws of Egypt and Canaan about same-sex marriage, which was apparently allowed there, and which Israelites were forbidden from following. So that's the first.
Oh, that is interesting.
Yeah, so same-sex marriage between females, and female-to-female intimacy, apparently, according to all the rabbis, did not make a woman unfit. She was, if a woman was unfit, so if she'd been a prostitute, then she was unfit and she couldn't marry a clergy, into the clergy. But if she had just had female-to-female sexual experiences, then that didn't make her unfit. However, Maimonides, who's one of the most famous commentators, Jewish commentators, said that female-to-female sexual activity was forbidden, but it's not punishable by lashing, since there is no specific prohibition against it, and in any case, no sexual intercourse takes place at all. So that was his view of it. And, I think sexual intercourse was what they were worried about it. So a priest could marry her, whereas a priest could not marry a harlot. But he could marry a woman who'd been intimate with another woman. However, but I'll just finish this bit from Maimonides, because, what a guy, so liberal. He says, But it is appropriate to flog such women since they have done a forbidden thing. A man should be particularly strict with his wife in this matter. So there we are.
So
You could marry a
it's
priest,
a forbidden
but you
thing,
might
but
get
not
flogged.
forbidden in the text of the Torah. Yeah.
I think I think that's the understanding.
But,
That there's no specific prohibition on it in the
isn't.
Torah. They were like, yeah, it's not good, and you can be flogged.
Okay, that's interesting. But
I guess
also,
that's better than being stoned to death.
there is a point to be made about the previous guy that you mentioned that was talking about what's the reason for them. No, don't lie with a man. As
the Rashi one.
Yeah, that one.
Yes.
There is something about this, about not equally, say, crossing to no woman to woman. And it's like, okay, so there might be something that his point might be more valid in the sense that there's something about male to male that was causing the problem with why the law is there, and there's something about female to female doing something that doesn't seem to be overtly stated at all as in a sense that you could say, well, we believe you shouldn't do it, but it doesn't. The law of only one way sort of thing is really interesting, isn't it? It's like, why, it does mention women in a beast though, doesn't it? An animal.
It does, yes.
So that there might be a reason for that then as well. And it's like, okay, so it's interesting that it doesn't mention a woman and a woman. It completely ignores it, and that has some implication of something. So it has to. It has to have an implication of something.
I think. Yes, I mean, what I think obviously what was absolutely prohibited and very, very strongly condemned was a woman doing anything which might cause her to become pregnant by somebody else, by some other man than her husband. Because the idea was that a man could not be expected to bring up somebody else's child. That all the sacrifices that a man would make for his family, he had to feel 100% confident that the children born to him by his wife or wives were his family. But I mean, if she was playing around with another woman, it wasn't likely that she was then going to marry someone and already be pregnant with somebody else's child. So that wasn't the issue. And yes, I think I think there probably is something to be said for the idea that they had this very strong view that the seed of a man was so sacred and it had to be conserved and used.
Something to do with seed. And there is that's what's overlooked. That kind of idea within the Torah is completely overlooked, isn't it? With just people talking about homosexuality in the fundamentalist churches anyway. They'd think, well, what are you talking about, seed and preservation? You know what I mean? But there does seem to be something to this in that culture. So we don't think of it like that today, do we? Like our seed, there's too many people in the world, so it's like we're not a small nation that's trying to make sure you don't go out of existence as a nation. So you want, at the moment, you think, okay, some countries it's like only have one child or no children, or maybe getting that way. Whereas here, it's a little nation wanting to survive. You can imagine it would all be about procreation and seed.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
and these things would hinder it,
swelling the ranks, swelling all the ranks of their numbers. Yeah,
and maybe doing this tack, you think all these bigger nations, if they're doing all these things that are actually hindering them, maybe Israel can grow bigger. There could have been thoughts like that. Wouldn't surprise me. Wouldn't surprise me.
Did you get a hint in this writing where it was trying to prohibit same-sex relationships to do with it not being natural, going against the nature God made us? Because that's something we haven't really covered that much in these discussions.
I can't remember that I did. I don't know. There may have been an element. I don't know. Do you not think that's more of a modern way of looking at things? I'm not sure. I'm kind of inclined to say that that's been used in more modern times as a justification.
Yes, that's
for
right.
Opposing it.
Yes,
and
that's right.
I think maybe sorry.
It's something we mentioned vaguely in passing last time, but didn't go into at all. And to me, it's the only option a Christian has got, or a traditional Jew, you could also say, has got to say, this is why God has told us that same-sex relationships are so bad, is because it goes against natural law, and that is an argument that can be made without reference to God saying he's a bit pissy about it, so therefore you mustn't. So, sorry, I'm not being very respectful.
I'm sure people will live with it. Nobody's going to be too shocked.
Yeah. Okay. I've just looked it up because I remember an episode of the fantastic Reasonable Doubts podcast.
Yeah.
Which is one of our inspirations. We haven't mentioned for a while, and their episode number 61 is all on that. And
oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll put a link in.
Right.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, to get to this deep? This really is deep dive compared with last week.
Yeah.
Last month, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've got some time left, so I'm keen to put this in the widest context possible, and go on a sort of world tour of same-sex prohibitions or not by religious.
It just sounded funny then, going on a world tour of same-sex.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're going on a real jolly.
That's right. Oh dear.
Yes,
okay.
it's like when you have a series and you want to make a film.
Yeah.
You solve the problem by making them all go on a holiday somewhere.
Yes.
Yes.
It's absolutely fabulous. Did that, and Are You Being Served? I think did it years ago.
Oh right. Okay. Yeah.
And Coronation Street did it.
Oh, did they?
And
I think
and Crossroads. I think Crossroads did it.
Yep. And the country house one that everybody raves about.
Oh, You Rang My Lord? Was it that one?
No, much more recent.
Oh, Downton Abbey.
Downton Abbey. They did it.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry about this. Anyway, so we're going on our world tour, and so we've done Christianity, and we have done we've done Judaism. I think just to fill in a bit with Christianity, I'm not aware of in history movements strongly trying to approve of same-sex marriage and monogamous long-term relationships. So it is this picture of a murky past, prohibition in the scriptures, that being the traditional line until very recently. I'm pretty certain that Islam will be the same. I didn't see much inclination to confirm that because it's pretty clear that the Quran has the same basic message as the Bible, and we hear about homosexual people being caught with homosexual activities being thrown off buildings. So let's move on. I'll just mention too that Mormons and Moonies, any kind of normal or kind of typical offshoot from Christianity, is also, they all have the same line. None of them that I'm aware of has suddenly changed that doctrine. So let's sort of start our tour going east. And in Hinduism, it's all a bit vague, and there are various sects in Hinduism with the whole range of attitudes, positive, neutral, and antagonistic. So there's nothing very clear-cut there, but we have to mention the Kama Sutra, of course, when it comes to Hinduism and sex. There is some description of it, of same-sex activity in the Kama Sutra.
Mm-hmm. And obviously there's no judgment in it. I take it there's no sort of,
I think so, yes.
It's not a negative thing.
And I think you could add that actually there's some medieval Hindu temples with artifacts that would indicate male homosexuality and lesbianism, like carvings and things, and because it's in that setting you'd assume that it's not being disproved of at all. Okay, so that's a quick go. Move on to Buddhism, and really there's nothing much it doesn't really say anything on it. And in history, would you believe it? The Dalai Lama, our current Dalai Lama, he did say back in the early 21st century that he interpreted sexual misconduct to be to include lesbianism and gay sex.
Right.
So it's not anything in the history, but even he, I think he got a bit of hot water over that.
I bet.
Say again?
I said, I'll bet.
Yes.
Sure, there would have been a lot of very disappointed Buddhists.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it, when this happens, because different groups who react in the opposite way, you could use the same term, getting in hot water. For example, when Steve Chalke in the evangelical world came in support of gay and lesbian relationships in the church, he got in so-called massive hot water with the evangelical world, like, taken to task and pilloried and said he's not a real Christian, all this sort of stuff. And on the other hand, if you're outside and you say something, another group of people will react against you depending on which way you go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the inside people have a go at him, and the outside are going, "Oh, what a brave man! It's great, and the church is moving on," and all the rest of it.
Yes.
And so you get different sides give you a different reaction when you say something like that. And whereas if in the evangelical church, if you say homosexuality is wrong, it's a sin, and it always was and always will be, you'll get praise, sort of, or affirmed and allowed to still speak at places because you're towing the tradition, Anyway.
Yeah. Sikhism sort of surprised me. You would have thought Sikhism would be like Islam and Christianity, but actually there's nothing about it in the scriptures. But again, a modern Sikh religious leader has said that he thinks it's totally against the laws of nature. So I guess he's speaking for himself rather than using his scriptures. Okay, Zoroastrianism. So that is quite heavy against, which is sort of contemporary with the writing of the Old Testament.
Yeah, interesting how it mentions lesbian then, and the Old Testament doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah,
well,
both. Yeah. Yes, I didn't say that. Taoism. So it's discouraged, you'd say, and some traditions find it to be misconduct. And then elsewhere in China, of course, Confucius, and it's no surprise that Confucius wasn't interested in the topic because it's just not his area of interest. He's more to do with politics and social society.
Yes, I mean it's not really a strong moral code, is it? It's more of an etiquette. It's more about a sort of a form of etiquette, I would say.
Yeah. So really, we haven't got much. Zoroastrianism, I guess, is the only big negative outside of the Abrahamic religion so far. And that's sort of the big religions. That's as far as it goes. So now we need to try and dig back behind all of these and look at some mythologies, and not to see about kind of law style prohibitions, but to try and get an angle on the attitudes of the people who are sharing these ancient myths, to see how they feel about it all. And the picture again is really quite neutral or even accepting of same-sex relationships. But it's difficult to sort of pin it down because they are just myths, and you have a story, you don't know how you're supposed to interpret it just by having the story. Now, there was one of them where the creation myth with both men. Here we go. This is pre-Confucianism, pre-Taoism in ancient China. And Oh
Is
dear.
In which shamanism?
Oh, was it
First two
into it?
humans
Yes. Yeah, there
were
we go.
both
Sorry.
male.
It was, no, I'm in the wrong country. Yeah, yeah. That's why you rescue me, Francis.
Yes. I rescued you when you'd gone too far abroad in
Right.
your gay research.
Yeah. So that's what I was grasping with the same-sex couple starting the human race. That is Intuit shamanism.
Mm-hmm. It may be pro-gay, but it is misogynistic.
So the voodoo spirits and deities, some of them seem to be quite pro gay and lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was my notes on pre-Confucian and pre-Taoist China?
Predominantly, so you say it's predominantly shamanistic. Male same-sex love was believed to have originated in the mystical South. Thus, homosexuality is sometimes still called Southern Wind. Numerous spirits or deities were associated with homosexuality, bisexuality, and transgender identities. How very modern.
Yeah. So it sounds like that isn't anything to do with anyone had a problem with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like modern day Camden, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think the big picture here is how hard it is to get any information at all.
Yes.
And when you do, it tends not to have a problem with gay and lesbian sex.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
To see a wider.
So that's the big picture, that actually Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions, even though they're dominant now in the world, it's not a traditionally dominant view to have that there's something morally awful about same-sex relationships.
It would be interesting to know, wouldn't it, in studies, not that you can really, I suppose, but in going, obviously we talked about a portion of the animal kingdom do same-sex stuff, and so when you go back to say hominids and Neanderthals and everything else prior to all of way thousands of millions of years, perhaps, or thousands anyway, before Old Testament stuff, what actually really happened in communities, you know, what were the developing laws and rules maybe in those cultures. Be interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's something, sadly, we're always, I mean, it would be fascinating to know, but I think we'll never get beyond speculation.
Imagine finding some bones of like clearly two females or something together in a situation, and you think, okay, this looks like a, you know, could just be by chance, but you know what I mean? Just to say things are discovered, and you think, it looks like the culture seemed to
yes.
Well,
then maybe they died in an earthquake.
Skeletons,
or maybe they died under judgment.
Yes.
Or being together. Yeah. So it's like, oh, they clearly didn't accept it. Look, they've been put to death. Yeah. Yeah. But it would be interesting though, wouldn't it? Just to know, because the animal kingdom does have a proportion of this going on, and it's like that because they aren't sophisticated brains and humans like us, they kind of get away with it. You know, it's not like there's other animals saying this is really wrong, you know. Because they do it. It's like, wow.
Yes,
and it is natural then, you know.
I think yes, there's a saying that homosexual behavior is found everywhere in the animal kingdom, but homophobia is only found in one species.
Wow. That summed up everything I just said in brilliant sentence. Excellent. Yeah.
Andrew, you sent us a link, and in that there was a discussion of how what's natural has changed. So they were saying how from up to about 1900, if not beyond, when you talked about homosexuality, it's not natural, and therefore, particularly interpreting Romans chapter 1, which talks about giving up natural relations for unnatural ones, that indicates how sinful it is. And the people in this link, I'll put it in the show notes, were then saying, well, of course, the modern people who now understand from science and just people now know so much more, that it isn't something that can be so clearly said to be unnatural. In fact, it's natural from what we've just been discussing. And therefore, it can't be talking about what we think it's talking about when it's talking about giving up unnatural
Well,
relationships for natural ones.
that comes out when gay people themselves, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, and they feel gay, they say, hey, this is not talking about me giving up. When did I, because the implication is, it's like, at least one way of looking at Romans, it's like, do you know what? I think I'm going to try the opposite sex, I'm going to hand myself over to it, and you gave up the natural, what would have been natural, and it, and you're doing something deliberately unnatural. That's so opposite to how a gay person would think about themselves. Matter of fact, they struggle to try and do what is considered natural, and I hear, was it us talking on the podcast or somewhere else I was hearing it about many people have sort of when the freedom to sort of come out, as it were, then people did separate from their wives and everything because they'd just been struggling and trying to do the so-called traditional thing, and ended up, moving on when they feel the freedom to, because they just can't deal with the struggle. So that's not handing over to wanting to do something unnatural, isn't it? So it's interesting terminology the way it is changed.
Good.
So anyway,
I think that's a good place to wind up, really.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So sorry, my phone went off then.
Should we have a quick silence and then we'll sign off?
Yeah, and then we'll come back in, and from there, I'll just need to text and say I can't.
Yeah, so I'll let you say the first thing, Andrew.
Yeah, from what we were just saying. Yeah, because I had a thing where I said, okay.
Yeah, and then just say, just close us down.
Okay, right. So that was, this has been so insightful, really has highlighted a more deep dive this time round for part 2. And I thank you, Francis, for such an in-depth springboard, really, to go and launch off to look at more, if anyone's interested in looking more into this. Hope it's been stimulating for anybody listening. Certainly has for me. And so perhaps leave one of you two to sort of wind up.
Well, I'm going to say goodbye from me, Ed.
Okay, and I'm going to say goodbye from me, Francis.
Okay, well, I'm going to say goodbye. I've been your host, Andrew. Until next time, goodbye.